There we go. Wonderful. Okay, can somebody at the back close the door for us? And we will start the session. Thank you. We at least have I think we have all the presenters here. I hope so. We will begin with the chair's overview. Go to the note well. This is the note well. Can one of the people in the conversation at the back do us the favor of closing the door? Thank you. So you've seen the note well, and I'm sure you've seen it too many times, but it really is important, so I will call your attention to it. I will not read it. If you are not, for some reason, familiar with it, please follow the links in it to the BCPs and go read them. Thank you. Next slide. We will go over the agenda, which is listed very briefly here, but in more detail on the next slide, and then a couple of summary slides from the chairs, and we will then let people present. We have a fairly loose schedule, so although I will watch time, I'm not going to be really hard with presenters, but if people are repeating themselves or whatever, I will ask to move on. Okay, we're doing the introduction, then Donald will talk about his draft on ECN, which has been adopted and is a working group draft on ECN for NSH. Following that, we have a presentation on active OAM from Greg Mirsky based on the working group draft on multi-layer OAM. And then Frank will be talking to us about the working group draft on IOAM, in-band OAM. And then again on his proof of transit work, which we had an extensive discussion last time, and I hope we have reached agreement on what's in there. And I think I told the authors that we had agreement. Then Ao Ting will be presenting 2 other drafts on OAM, the path consistency and return path. And then finally, the Yang, which we have not had enough attention to. The IETF really expects us to do Yang, and she will present a starting point on Yang, which we can then discuss. So, status. First thing is to note that DC allocation is a working group draft. We could request informational publication, but I haven't seen any working group interest. And in the absence of interest, we can't request working group publication. If nobody does anything, if there aren't enough people who say they want to see interest, we're just going to have to let it die. It's okay, we can do that. We can mark it dead. But it was a working group draft. For the information of this community, the MPLS SFC encapsulation draft was approved by the IESG. It was an MPLS working group draft, which was liaised to us, and Andy held the pen on it. Thank you, Andy. And it has been approved for publication. It is now in the hands of the RFC editor. There was a presentation just now. No, this was different. So there's been presentation in the past on draft Gishard Spring NSH, which has been presented and is likely to be adopted in the spring working group. Just, again, something that will be liaised with us, advanced in a different working group. Part of the reason I worked with Jim to put together a status slide is this last point. We managed to get through getting RFC 8300 out without doing a lot of work on security. But we did make a promise to the various area directors that we would actually address it. Jim and I have been begging you folks for people to address it. We have a slide that talks about it in one narrow context on the next slide that was requested by Mohammed Bokadir. And we have Frank's work on proof of transit, which is a little piece of the security puzzle. It's a nice little piece. It's an elegant little piece, but it's a little piece of the puzzle. We really need to address this. We need some people to step forward to address this. This is not a case where the chairs can just throw out a draft and it'll all work out right. No, we shouldn't be writing this draft because we need to shepherd it. We need people to do this. I'm not asking for volunteers this minute, but I want you guys to think about it because we made a promise that we would address this. Okay, next slide. One of the drafts we adopted since the last meeting is the IETF-SFC Service ID header draft. There was some name confusion with it, but we adopted it. We know which draft we mean. And it specifies a couple of TLVs for subscriber identifiers. It still uses 8300, and it lacks integrity protection. So Med was wondering, reasonably, should he be addressing the integrity protection in the context of his specific TLVs? And if we don't have a working group approach that it crosses TLVs and protects multiple pieces of metadata, then we have to go and look at protection for each individual TLV instead. And that seems to me to be a very painful path to go down. But he asked us to bring up this issue to the working group. I gathered he couldn't be here even though we're in Europe this time and he's in France. We all have trouble traveling even short distances periodically. So we wanted to call attention that he is asking for feedback from the working group on this particular topic and that this is a subtopic of a much bigger topic for the working group as a whole. Does anybody want to comment on this? Either the general or the specific. As I expected, bring up Donald's presentation. And we'll give him, and here's the clicker.
Thank you. You're welcome. No rush. Hi there, I'm Donald Eastlake. So I'm going to talk about this fairly recently adopted working group draft on ECN support using the network service header. So goals of ECN are to collect congestion information. And in this case, with the congestion information is within a service function chaining domain. And to do that by a method of marking in the frames rather than by just noticing that packets have been dropped. So if you drop packets, you typically have to retransmit them and so forth, or it causes things to be less efficient than if you can avoid the congestion in some other way. And so the way it's implemented also, if you happen to have end-to-end ECN, so that the service function chaining domain is part of that, then it contributes to collection of congestion information over that longer path. And then it has in it a standard method for communicating this congestion information back to the classifiers at the entrance to that service function chaining domain. So it uses ECN bits in the network service header, and it specifies how to communicate information back using IP flow, information export, IPFix rather, and that seems like a useful thing to have for a standard method. So this sort of shows an original sender and a final receiver. There's a congestion feedback loop overall, and as part of that path, we have a service function chaining domain and a bunch of service function forwarders and service functions. And this provides a way to have information about congestion within that domain communicated to the egress and feed that back to the ingress of that domain. So, basically there aren't that many bits available, so you just pick a couple of them. Of course, if you have sufficiently strange things happen and sufficient bursts of congestion and so forth, it is still possible that packets will get dropped in severe cases, but normally that will not happen. So the reason to specify a method for sending this condition information back to the classifier is so that if you have a mixed vendor service function chaining domain, you can still do that. That's why the standardized method suggested. You certainly some particular implementation, if it's all from some other vendor or whatever, could use a different method. There is a draft in TSVWG on tunnel congestion feedback, which provides a mechanism for doing this. So basically the suggestion is that you use that. And because the statistics in there are cumulative, if some of those messages were lost, then it would not mess up your information feedback. Then this question has been brought up about exactly what actions the classifier can possibly take. So this is simply taken from the current draft, and I think a little more discussion of this on the list has been called for. It would be reasonable. You need to be very careful about this to avoid undesirable interactions between actions you might be taking within the service function chaining domain and actions you might be taking in the overall path from the original source to the final end. So I don't know if I want to talk too much more about that. I think there has been some commenting on the list, which you could take a look at if you haven't already. And perhaps some of these could be reduced and some additional caveats may need to be added there to be sufficiently cautious about things you could do to make sure you don't have any undesirable interactions with overall path feedback. Because all this stuff works better if you have ECN implemented throughout your service function chaining domain. If any particular service function doesn't implement it, then you can still get a lot of the benefit by doing it in either having it at the service function forwarder or in the proxy if the SF doesn't even recognize the network service header at all. But to the extent that you don't have it implemented at some place which could be a bottleneck, whether it's in a service function or SFF or just a router between SFFs or anything like any place that there could be a bottleneck, if that particular bottleneck doesn't implement ECN, then that congestion won't be managed by the ECN mechanism. So it's, on the ideal case, you would have it at any place there might be a bottleneck. So I want to refine the draft and welcome comments. And after the draft has been refined a bit, perhaps we could move to a working group last call.
Questions for Donald? Opinions? Okay, thank you, Donald. Thank you for presenting it. Next, Greg, you're up.
Works or
Clicker works as soon as you get it set up. Thank you. There we are. It should work.
Okay, so this is to bring update on the document active OEM for SFC networks. Well, this is not exactly the name. The name is Draft IETF SFC multi-layer OEM. We had very good discussion in Bangkok. And after discussion, made update to address comments received from Adrian when we reviewed how combination of OBIT and protocol field can be used to identify the presence of OEM data or commands in headers of an SH or in a payload. And then we updated SFC echo request reception procedure, return codes, reply, echo reply reception procedure, and IANA considerations. So on interpretation of all bit in the next protocol field, for their case where their IAM is in extension header, we clarified that it's in a fixed length context header or variable length context header. So the text was not clear about it. Another combination is that when all bit is clear and the next protocol is not of is one of OEM protocols, then it's an erroneous situation, and that's what we discussed with Adrian. That's what Adrian pointed out that was missing in our definition, because we're only defining their positive and what not looking for erroneous combination of information elements. And what is added in the text is that we recommend to avoid the combination of OEM in a extension headers and in a payload, because it cannot be unambiguously identified using combination of all bit in the next protocol field. Any questions? So do we have your agreement with the changes?
That will have to be confirmed on the list. It seems right, but it needs to be confirmed on the list.
Right. So again, please read the draft, think about these changes, and share your comments. For IANA considerations, so we we provided a specification for how echo request replies worked. We introduce mandatory TLVs and optional TLVs. So we defined return codes. There are only 3 of them, I think. Yep. Now, appreciate your comments, consideration, comments at the mic or on the list.
Do we, the obvious question, I think, is in the affirmative, but I want to check. Are we reasonably confident that if we get an echo request we can't parse, that it really is an echo request and we really know who we should tell about it? It's this error code 1, malformed echo request. I always worry when I see malformed errors. Do we have enough information to correctly return the error to the right person?
Okay, it's a good question. I think that we definitely will need to provide more explanation of what has to be returned along with this code, because again, I'm just thinking on my feet. They need to return the original TLV that caused it with this code.
And enough context to be parsed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a little more wording will probably be needed for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a very good suggestion, and we'll work on adding this because, yeah, it is. So it has to be practical so that the code is can be correlated with the offensive TLV, and then the sender can really understand the situation, and then, you know.
Or a human being. Somebody has to be able to understand.
Yeah, right. And again, I'll point out that because now we introduce 2 classes of TLVs that can be used in the request, so mandatory and optional, then we expect that for optional, even if TLV is not understood, it will not trigger the response with a malformed TLV. But yeah, we'll add more verbiage about it and being more clear about their possible use of mandatory and optional to type codes.
Okay. Any questions, comments? We're going to end way ahead of schedule. Okay. Next.
Okay.
Frank. And Frank, while you're coming up, I'm going to make one comment about this draft. This was something I probably told you guys quite a long time ago. But since we're almost done with it, you need to address the number of authors. We are not going to request publication with 10 front page authors.
We can do that, right?
I'm sure you can.
Yeah.
Please.
We got to go and arm wrestle the ego question. Okay.
I understand the questions. It's just we got to solve.
Well, I
Thank
think
you.
we got to go and create an author section and then do the editor thing or whatever. Okay, so we're really quick update. So we're going to go and further get ahead of schedule, I believe. Quick update on the Nsh Draft. There is not real update on that document other than Carlos did a bunch of clean up the references, make it kind of the most recent references. One little bit of an alignment on the header so that it's fully in sync with 8300. There was a kind of a misreference earlier on. That's pretty much it, along with the need to go and consolidate the author list. So not sure whether anybody else sees anything else that we need to go and get done in this particular document. Would be nice to go get some sense from the people in the room, if we could call it done, assuming we clean up the author list. Okay. The next one, no? Okay. The next one is the proof of transit draft. That received a fair amount of conversation on the list, and Joel, to his earlier point, summarized it like, yeah, well, we've seen some discussioning happening, and you, well, concluded that we should go and consolidate the number of options in the draft to just using for ordered proof of transit to use a single mechanism instead of documenting two. That's what we've done. So the one section, and it was just a few lines that was talking about nested encryption, just appeared. That's the major change in the document from a content perspective, and that is what we discussed on the list, and also at IETF in Bangkok. The other one is, and I have to really thank you, Tal, for a really detailed walkthrough the document and coming up with saying, well, we need this net fixed, and this net fixed. And so he made me sit down really right before the deadline and fix all these little nits that he found, which I believe is really good because it provided for another level of clarity. Kind of cross-references within the document where questions can be answered by really looking at the Yang model that we have in the document around kind of what units do you use, what ranges of values do you expect. All of that is nicely articulated by the Yang model, so we don't need additional text for that. So that's been added. And again, it was this one kind of content change around focusing on quadruple S, so Shamir secret sharing only. The other one is kind of a raft of proofreading that Tal provided for.
That actually raises an interesting question, because I would like to get this document out the door, but I'm not sure we want a freestanding IOAM SFF. Or there are probably pieces that deal with all. Do we? Well, doesn't matter what I want. Do we, as a working group, want a separate MIB module just for IOAM for proof of transit specifically, or do we need to somehow integrate it in the non-existent Yang model, which would slow us down? I mean, I don't want to slow us down, but it feels a little weird. Anybody care to comment on whether we should just have a separate Yang model for this? Sorry, that's the mic we've got.
Again, it's an odd arrangement. Greg Mirsky, and it doesn't work.
It does actually work. It is helping.
Okay. Greg Mirsky, ZT. Yeah, I think that because the proof of concept is one of their application of IOM to SFC, it would make sense it to be a part of SFC IOM Yang model.
The only problem is they've used the Yang as a good, and I like it, way of elucidating the ranges, and we'd have to restructure things to separate it out for inclusion in some other draft. And I also want to recognize you guys did the work on the Yang modeling already.
Yeah, we can go
I'm
with farm.
torn.
We could go, and I think probably the easier way is to farm that. If you really want that, we can farm it out into a dedicated document, because well, some of that is pretty much also implemented as a standalone document, as a standalone Yang model in ODL. That's almost used one-to-one of what is in ODL as running code. So which is why I have some sympathy for keeping it as a dedicated model. We can always kind of obviously amend the larger model with that one. But given that it's a mechanism that is pretty much standing on its own feet, not sure whether somebody else in the future might want to leverage in an equal way. If somebody else comes up with service chaining for a similar context,
Maybe they want the same POT and the same.
maybe they want similar proof of transit. So I have some sympathy for keeping it separate, but we can farm it out into a dedicated document if people feel that that helps. Again, not sure because we have a load of cross-references right now. But yeah, that's my personal opinion.
I think simple, can you send an email to the list noting that you've got a Yang model for this proof of transit work in the document and asking the list whether they're comfortable with keeping that Yang model in this document?
Okay.
Because I would actually, if the working group is comfortable with it, we can advance it that way.
Okay, cool. Works for me.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay.
Thank you. You're running way faster.
Yes, I know. We're way ahead of schedule. It's absurd. If I'd known, we would have asked for 1 hour.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ting from ZT. This presentation is about COM, which is to introduce which is used to check the consistency of the SFC parse. I'd like to introduce the COM first, in case this is your first time to read this draft. From this diagrams, you can see that once SFFF received a COM request message, it will take 2 actions. One is to forward the COM request message to its next SFF, and another action is that the SFF will send back a COM reply message with the information of the SF that attached to this SFF. And so with collecting all the COM reply message, we can get the path of this service function chain, and the orders of the service functions can be checked as well. This draft has been presented several times, and so this time I will present the modification from 0.3 version. In this modification, we mainly focus on the consideration of load balance with multiple SF service functions. First, we change SF information TLV to SFF information record TLV, so that SFF can include the information of service functions into this TLV in the COM reply message. And we changed the SF information TLV to be a sub-TLV. And we also reorganized the format of this sub-TLV so that in this sub-TLV we can support the SF ID type and SF identifier to be a list. And to make the procedure to be clearly, so we also provide two examples. One example is that multiple service functions as hosts of SFP in SFF. In this case, the information about each service functions must be listed as a separate SF information sub-TLVs in the COM reply message. And another example is that multiple service functions attached to one SFF is for load balance. In such scenario, the SF identifiers and SF ID type of all these SFs will be listed in the SF identifiers field and SF ID type field in a single SF information sub-TLV. That's all we are in our modification. And I want to say that this draft has been presented 4 times in previous meetings. And we have updated the draft for many times according to the comments in meeting and the discussion in the mail list. I think the draft is ready for working group adoption, and always I hope everyone could review this draft and give us comments and support. Thank you.
Comments, questions? Okay, we'll move on to the next draft, which is the last draft on our agenda. So I will thank folks for having made the time to come in here right now.
Okay, the second presentation is about SF Young model. The motive of this work is that SFC Young model is a milestone in our charter, so it's also required in our SFC working group. And I want to say that this Young model is based on RFC 7665 and RFC 8300. And I want to make it clear that this Young model is mainly focused on the configuration of SFF and the state information of SFF. For classifier Young model, I think that will be our work in later. This slide shows the design tree of the SF in configuration. In this design tree, you can see that we can configure the SF, configure the SFF identifier name and the SFP that the SFF belongs. And in SFP configuration, we also have SFP ID, SI, service index, metric, next hop, and the last SFF. And the SFP ID and SF is the keys, are the keys of the SFP. And in the next hop, there are types to indicate is the next hop is a SFF or a specific SF. And there's a transport type as well. Currently, in this Young model, we only support VXLAN GPE interface and Ethernet interface. And in this slide, the diagram shows the SF state information. Currently, only configuration information can be read in this state information. And we also solicit your comments or your contribution about this part. And next steps, we got some very important comments. We really appreciate that. And according to these very useful comments, we plan to update the draft in the following 4 aspects. One is to add to support the configuration for the SFF list to support the multiple SFF instance. Another is to add to provide the interface list that this SFF should support. And we will add to support a new transport type, that is MPRS. And the last, I and my co-authors will restructure the YANG model to make it be more extensible. And as always, any comments and questions are welcome. And I also hope everyone could review this draft and give us any suggestions and comments. And we will appreciate you if you could join us on this work. Thank you.
So I have a comment. I seem to remember that Ronaldo Peno wrote a SFC YANG draft that's expired quite some time ago, but it was based off of the VPP implementation. So my question is whether you actually cross-referenced on that and have, I don't think he's working in this area anymore, but what's important is that YANG model came from the actual implementation. So it might be worth at least looking at to make sure that it kind of aligns with, that you haven't missed anything in the YANG model that you've defined here.
Okay, I will.
So if you look at it, it'll
first.
be draft Peno-SFC-YANG or something like that. But it's probably expired for a couple of years now, Joel, I would think.
Yeah,
I
if
didn't
you
know.
just tell it to include expired drafts in the search, it will find it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you for
Frank?
Frank Rogers, I think the other interesting reference that you might want to go and look into.
sorry,
is-
could you please speak a little louder?
I can eat the mic, maybe.
Clearly.
So the other thing that you might want to go and consider is looking at all the SFC models that exist in Open Daylight. There's quite a few, and that's a fairly extensive project that, well, is maybe a little past the hype, but it's still progressing. And OPNFV, for instance, continues to leverage that, so it might be worthwhile to look at the YANG models that are defined there as well.
So do you mean we need to also include the policy of the policy?
It's not the policy. I think it's like see what's been implemented and see what you can leverage from the implementation.
Okay, we will add such content.
Okay, any other questions on that? Any other questions for the working group or the chairs? Failing that, with my apologies to the IESG for requesting a 2-hour slot when we needed less than 1. Thank you very much for your time, and we are done.
Thank you.
Tal, you'll take the blue sheets to the Secretariat? Thank you. Yes? Very well. Thank you.
That's fine.
Finding a separate set of PLCs would be great.
There's no reason why it's,
Atrium is another policy for so talk to Martin when he's able to discuss it.
Yep.
Obviously, I'm under much less time.
I need some time to open the file.
It's okay, I'm just gonna put the mic away, so.
The man was
Yes.
or trying to show the minimum time within 5 minutes.
Well, I have, we ended so early, I have plenty of time. Control and misleading,
Separate.
Okay.
So I think this is
It's an interesting question.
actually it's quite simple
Oh,
for NSH.
no,
It's a couple of
I don't know the details you picked, but the shape follows naturally from the statement. Okay, take the packet you're trying to encapsulate, slap an NSH header on it, slap whatever transport you need on it, and send it.
yes.
And in fact, that addresses one of my concerns with some of the proposals, because one of the things which NSH can do easily is actually need some metadata. Like, which port did this arrive on? It's often needed, and so there is some advantage. Now, so the first question I have to ask, given the complexities of the situation,
Yeah, I understand.
where do you want to take this? Do you view it as a contribution here? Do you view it as a contribution to PDF? Do you view it as something that you take to both places?
Right here.
Oh, okay. I don't, you can't. This would put me in a very awkward position. Because usually, in my experience with, I've done a lot of stuff. Done it many times. It's very important to align representation of, for example, metadata as used in the packet redirect function, whatever you want to call that, with, which is what the service, what's called the service interface in some descriptions, with the way information is described in the control packet. If you have two different representations, you end up with inconsistency. Now, that leads to, we also, so the other, sorry, I'm sort of mixing ideas as I think through this. Next thing that occurs to me is, except for any special TLVs, there isn't anything for the SFC working group to standardize. Because the SFC working group does not standardize applications of SFC. We don't tell you how to use